the 26th number. You can be the judge of that by the end of this. Look, I want to welcome Kevin and Bob to the live Learn Lunch today. We've been really excited about this proposition coming to us for a number of weeks now, since we talked about the design and the elements and everything. Today is around often a challenging subject around unemployment and suicide. I can't think of anyone better to deliver aspects to this to you. So I'll hand over very, very shortly to our presenters today. I want to remind you that all the other webinars in our series are available on the IEP YouTube channel, which I'll put the link in the chat again a bit later on. And we've got some other incredible webinars coming up around coaching, online development, virtual first aid, another one around with our fellow colleagues today from Big Dog, Little Dog are doing something in a few weeks' time again as well. We've got the Digital Technology Conference coming up in September. Please book your free tickets, and I say yes, free tickets for about 3 hours worth of learning there. And I know Big Dog, Little Dog in their various guises will be back helping support that activity as well. Make sure you go to the YouTube channel, make sure you subscribe, get the latest updates, and if you're not receiving the information that you should be receiving through the IEP, go to our website, I'll put the link in the chat, and make sure you start engaging with the IEP. And I just wanted to say really, really quickly now that this is a very, very important subject matter today, a subject matter that is challenging often and potentially difficult to talk about. But you guys need to be as well tooled and as well skilled as you possibly can be across all aspects of your delivery. You are specialists, you are amazing at what you do, and don't forget that. In your day-to-day interactions and when things become challenging and difficult, you're doing this and very few other people could. And so just remember that as we go through the learning today, and remember that as you go back to your office or your kitchen table or your bedroom later on and you're serving and supporting customers, because without you, they wouldn't be anywhere near as far forward as they are. So just remember that. So look, I won't talk anymore. I've been talking for far too long already. I'm going to hand you over to Kevin and Bob from Big Dog, Little Dog, and say thank you and welcome to Kevin and Bob.
Thanks, Scott. Thank you very much.
Yes, Scott.
And good afternoon to everybody. Before we get underway, just a couple of points we'd like to make. First of all, as Scott's mentioned, this is a sensitive subject area. We don't know any of your backstories. We don't know if you might have lost someone through suicide. You might have had suicidal thoughts yourself at some point in time. You may have even attempted suicide. We're not going to be showing you any graphic images. We're not going to be talking about methods of death, but that doesn't make any of us immune. So please, throughout the session, check in with yourself. If the session is affecting you negatively, Scott said we are recording this, and it's absolutely okay to step away from this session and visit the recording once you're in a better place. Second point to make before we begin, if you've read the IEP newsletter this week, you'll be aware that we recently lost Sam from jobseeker through suicide. Sam's story, I never met Sam. I've spoken to people about him. I've read about him. Sounds like he was an incredibly positive, dynamic, creative, compassionate human being. Someone who outwardly presented as a great chap with little troubles. Yet his demons got the better of him and he died by suicide. So even though today's session is specifically around unemployment and suicide, please let's all acknowledge that none of us are immune to it. So let's be kind to ourselves. Okay, with that said, I'll now bring up the slide deck and we'll get underway. First thing is a small task for you. Could you please get your mobile phones out and take your phone browser to the web address you're seeing at the bottom of the screen, wooclap.com/IEP webinar. It's not case sensitive, and if you've done it right, you should have a screen like on the middle of our screen appearing on your phone. WooClap is a resource we use that allows us to ask questions of our audience and for you to be able to answer and for us to see your answers in real time. It is entirely anonymous. And in this session, we're not going to be asking you any questions, for instance, about have you ever had suicidal thoughts? So if you can and you want to, please do take your phone to that address and make sure that that message has appeared on your screen. It's not a deal breaker if you can't get to the site. If you are getting any kind of error, typically it's a typo in the address. So it's wooclap.com/IEP webinar. And I'll show you that address again whenever we ask you a question. So let's push on. First of all, a quick intro from ourselves. If you've not heard of us before, we are Big Dog, Little Dog. We can't really make the point so well online, but if we were standing next to each other, you'd get it. I'm the big dog. Bob there is the little dog. We recently got referred to as the Morecambe and Wise of mental health training, which I think was a compliment. But little dog, I got it this morning. We are the Jay and Silent Bob of our world.
That's better than Morecambe and Wise, I'll take that.
I'm the gobby one, you're the little fat one.
Cheers, Paul.
Who are we? 95% of what we do is mental health training, from mental health first aid to more bespoke stuff. We are of the sector. So Bob and I have both run welfare to work organisations. I've run a few over the years. Bob quit his job as chief exec of Twining Enterprise, the mental health and employment charity, when we created Big Dog, Little Dog. We decided when we got to the grand old age of 50 that we no longer wanted the rat race. We no longer wanted the pressures of having to get more and more important, take on more and more responsibility, earn more and more money. We actually decided we wanted to start enjoying life a bit. So pre-lockdown, typically we work 3 or 4 days a week, doing what we love, delivering the training. About 5% of our time doing consultancy work, helping organisations improve mental health in their workplace. So enough about us. Let's get into the subject area. What are we looking at today? The lion's share of our hour is going to be around suicide awareness. And I am going to ask you a few questions in that. So hopefully there's that web address again. You're all pointed at that web address. You're seeing that message up on the screen. Bob, are all the cameras off?
I think they are, Kev, yep.
Wonderful. Is everyone muted except us?
And muted too, yes.
Wonderful stuff. If you have any questions that can wait, please post them in chat. If you have a burning question, then please turn your camera on and Bob will spot you. I'm the, if you like, the star of this. I'm doing all the talking. Bob is the all-important director in the background, watching what's going on and sitting in the chat room. So if you have a burning question that you need me to stop talking for, come off of camera mute, make yourself known to Bob, and Bob will stop me in my tracks. Also, just to mention chat, what we found with the webinars we've been delivering over the last few months is attending a webinar is a bit like watching a movie. Some people like to focus purely at what's on screen and what's being said. And if that's your preferred way of attending this webinar, that's absolutely fine. But some people, when they watch a movie, like to have a natter about what's going on screen. Similarly, some people like to have a chat about the subject within the chat room during a webinar. So if you want to go into the chat room and have a natter, Bob's in there. He may even ask you a question or two. If you'd rather just focus in on content, that's absolutely fine. In terms of the contents of the slides today, if you do want to drop us an email at that address, we'll happily send you a PDF across of every slide in the deck. In terms of contents today, major part of it is about the significance of suicide to unemployment. We'll also then touch on what does good look like in terms of talking to someone about suicidal thoughts. And we will show you briefly some staff training options out there. This is part 1 of a 2-part series. Part 2 is 2 weeks today. This session is predominantly aimed at frontline workers. The session in 2 weeks' time is predominantly aimed at managers and business owners. So let's get stuck in. First of all, on the subject of suicide, we'll have a look at some stats here and see where the problem lies. You can see there the most recent data available, over 8,000 preventable deaths. Couple of important things to note between road traffic accident deaths and known suicides. First of all, known suicides are decided by a coroner. So the way that the system of death works in this country is, unless the reason for death is obvious, a coroner will investigate and come to a verdict. So what we're looking at here is how many coroner verdicts there were in 2018, not necessarily how many suicides. And because a coroner needs to be pretty confident of the verdict, the actual number of suicides is likely to be larger. Key when we look at this data is we've got the numbers the wrong way round. So in actuality, in terms of known suicides in the UK, there's about 17 a day. For every 1 death in a road traffic accident, there's more than 3 deaths by suicide. Okay, let's get you doing some thinking now. On your phones, please. This question should now be appearing. If it isn't, please put your finger in the middle of your screen and drag down to refresh it. And then this question should magically appear on your phone. Remember, please, your answers are anonymous. So there's a statement here that says 1 in 10 suicides worldwide is linked to unemployment. If you think it's true, choose true. If you think the real number's higher, go for the up arrow. If you think the real number's lower, go for the bottom arrow. And we can see out of the 30 people logged on to WooClap so far, we've had a good number answering, nearly half. Someone on a Galaxy S9 phone, it seems to be drawing ink instead, but that's fine. So we've had half of you respond. Let's see if we can get a couple more responses and we'll find out what the correct answer is. So 31 of you now connected to WooClap, of which 16 have answered. So over half of you have answered. Good stuff. Squeeze one more answer. There we go. So majority of you saying it's more than 1 in 10. Let's see what the correct answer is. And well done to those who went for the first option. In fact, it's 1 in 5. 1 in 5 suicides worldwide linked to unemployment. So there is a very clear link between the two. So now let's think specifically about ESA customers. I've got another WooClap for you. You may need to drag your screen down to refresh it. So it's straightforward, true or false. ESA claimants, as they were, and let's also think people on UC who have the ESA component, at least 3 times more likely to self-harm, attempt suicide, or have suicidal thoughts. True or false? Fantastic. We've beaten the last question's record already. 20 out of 31, 22 out of 32. So overwhelmingly, you're saying that's true. Let's see. The correct answer is true. And let's just take a minute or two to look at the stats here, because there's some very interesting and alarming data. Every 7 years, the Adult Psychiatric Morbidity Survey is carried out in the UK. So this is a large-scale survey where people are asked about their mental health. So first of all, important point to note, the data I'm about to show you is self-reported data. It doesn't come from doctors, from clinical records. This is people when asked. Amongst the general population in the most recent 2014 survey, 7.3% of people said they had self-harmed at some time in their life. Just over 20% said they'd had suicidal thoughts. Just think about that one in isolation for a moment. Amongst the general population, more than 1 in 5 people have had suicidal thoughts. And then in terms of attempted suicide, 6.7% of people said they had tried to kill themselves at some stage in their life. So that's the general population stats. Now let's look at ESA claimants. For self-harm, more than a third of people who responded to the survey said they had self-harmed. Suicidal thoughts amongst ESA claimants. That suggests it's twice as likely that you will have had suicidal thoughts than if you wouldn't have had, if you're claiming ESA. The overwhelming majority of ESA customers have had suicidal thoughts. And in terms of attempting suicide, nearly half of ESA customers have at some stage in their life tried to kill themselves. So comparing that to the general population, 4.5 times greater prevalence amongst ESA customers for self-harming, over 3 times suicidal thoughts, and over 6 times the amount of attempted suicide. Okay, another woo clap for you. True or false, suicide risk typically peaks at 6 months of unemployment. True or false? Apologies for the background noise. That's my strawberry water. It's in my rider. So great, we've got 34 people connected and 24 have responded. Give it another couple of seconds because 25 is a nice half century. There we are. So the majority of you say false. Correct answer is it's just 1 month. Suicide risk peaks at 1 month of unemployment, and that peak doesn't go down for 5 years. So we've got some very clear links emerging here between suicide and unemployment. So then there's the question, why do people choose to die? And of course, this is a very individual thing. Different people take their lives for different reasons. If we were to look for the 6 most common components we see in suicides, they would be these. First of all, most but not all suicides involve mental ill health. Most commonly depression, but it by no means has exclusive rights. Hopelessness. I do not believe that my life can improve. Alongside that, helplessness. I do not believe anyone can get me out of my situation. We know that substance misuse, many substances are depressants, and many substances lower our inhibitions. We're more likely to act on impulse and therefore suicidal thoughts when we're under the effects of substances. Finally, being left alone with our thoughts. So those 5 components together, and then in the bottom right of your screen, most commonly, some kind of trigger event happens, which doesn't necessarily have to be anything major. Arguably, when it happens is more important than what the event is. So thinking about unemployment now, I'm going to get you woo clapping again. Slightly different type of woo clap now. And to begin with, please hold off. Do refresh your screen, but don't put an answer in yet. We're going to build a nice pretty word cloud now, and Bob's going to go first. Unemployment does not cause suicide. Unemployment does introduce a range of factors that are suicide risks. So Bob's now going to type in what one of those factors is. So go for it, Bob. Bob's typing his answer in his phone, and then he's clicked submit. That's now appeared on your phone screen. Under it is a like button. So if you think, I was going to say that, tap on that like button, please. Now, let's get some answers out of you. So type an answer in and then submit. But before you type it in each time, see if anybody else has already done it. So like an answer if it's already there. If it isn't there, chip in with it, please. Good stuff. Seen a lot coming through. Notice whenever anybody taps that like button, that answer gets bigger. So because you all liked Bob's answer, debt is currently the biggest one of the lot. But if there are any others that you think, I agree with that, please do tap on that like button. Good, thank you. So we can certainly agree that there's a number of factors that come along with unemployment that are suicide risks. So I'm going to move on from that one now and look at the main ones with you. So first of all, being unemployed has strong links with mental ill health. And the stat we look at there is after 13 weeks of unemployment, you are 4 to 10 times more likely to experience anxiety and or depression. So unemployment, strong chance of bringing mental ill health with it. Sure, you've all heard of empty nest syndrome, when that final child leaves the house and the parent loses a sense of purpose that's been there for many years. Well, can't that also be said of losing your job? So never mind empty nest syndrome, I'm going to call it empty life syndrome that comes with unemployment. Perspective, the mindset that develops when you're unemployed. And I think back to when I was unemployed 25 years ago, and pretty much on the dot at the 3-month stage, I gave up. I thought, who'd want to give me a job now? So those two words we saw earlier of hopelessness and helplessness often accompany unemployment. Final big one to mention is, of course, the financial consequence of unemployment, trying to get by on benefits. And we all know of news stories that have appeared in the press. So they're the major ones, but yes, you've come up with a range of others. Others we'd certainly mention. In some cultures, there's a shame that comes along with unemployment. There's a sense of failure that comes along with it. I can't provide for my family the way I want to. Rates of self-harm are higher in unemployed people. And people who self-harm for a long period of time are 49 times more likely to die by suicide than someone who doesn't self-harm. We know self-medication is relatively common amongst the unemployed, and social isolation is more likely when we haven't got the workplace to fulfill our social needs. So a range of different reasons why unemployment does ultimately feed suicidal thoughts. That's, of course, not the only things that might be going on in someone's life. And we always like to look at the pathways to reducing reoffending when we think about a breadth of support needs. So even when we get someone employment, the anxiety of starting a new job could lead to suicidal thoughts. We're about to hit an avalanche of people being released from their job. We've heard today we're now officially in recession. Poor employment and poor employers, but a range of reasons across these different areas of life can all contribute to potential suicidal thoughts. Please remember, you can get this slide deck off of us after today. And now, before I move on to how do you talk to people about it, let's just look at this thing called the ripple effect. We're going to woo clap one final time. This time I'm going to get a number out of you. So here's your question. According to research, how many people are affected by a single suicide? How many people's lives are impacted by a single suicide? Put a number in, please, and then submit it. So we're getting quite a broad range coming at the moment. 10 is the smallest, 1,000 is the biggest. Just give you a few more seconds for any other answers. Our range now is 6 to 1,000. Fantastic. Thank you for that. Let's find out, shall we? Different research suggests different numbers, but they're all in the same ballpark. Certainly the research we look at suggests that for every death by suicide, 115 people's lives get affected. What's known as the ripple effect. And just like if you drop a pebble into water and watch the ripples, those ripples are always strongest nearer the point of impact. So within that research, it suggests that about 20% of those people will be affected to a devastating level. So just to analyse that, that would suggest that each death by suicide leads to more than 20 people's lives being devastated. So how do we talk to people about suicidal thoughts? Now, this is a short webinar. This is a short segment within that, so we can't go into detail. In a quick 5-minute jobby, what can we tell you? We've created an acronym just for this webinar. We've decided to give it a 4-leaf clover as a bit of luck and hope in our lives. So think of the acronym LEAF as the 4 aspects of a good conversation. The language we use when we talk to people, the environment that we talk to them in, the agreement that we reach with them, and the focus throughout the conversation. What do we mean by each of those letters? Well, the language needs to be positive. It's easy to get drawn into someone's bad news, bad life story, and to start agreeing and almost feeding it. We want to be the positive within that. When we get to the point of asking someone if they are feeling suicidal, we need to be direct and leave no room for doubt. But there's a difference between direct and blunt. Big challenge for you now. There are 2 phrases used in suicide that we want to avoid. Let's see if you can stop using them. The first is successful suicide attempt. We don't like using a positive word like successful with something as tragic as a suicide attempt. See if you can no longer say that. People either did or didn't kill themselves. The bigger challenge is no longer using the phrase commit suicide. You may well know that up to 1961, suicide was a criminal offence in this country. Just think about that one for a moment. If you killed yourself, you could be arrested for it. 2 reasons really why it was a criminal offence. First of all, when you make an act a criminal offence, then attempting that act also has a power of arrest. So in the days before sectioning, it was a way that the police could take you to a place of safety. Secondly, the punishment for suicide was that all of your property would be seized by the state. Your family would become homeless and destitute overnight. So the idea was that the punishment for suicide was so woeful that you wouldn't kill yourself. So there was good intent behind it, but when we criminalise something, we add stigma to it. Someone considering suicide is probably feeling guilty enough already without us using a judgmental word like commit. So please see if you can use either they completed suicide or they died by suicide. Lastly, on the language front, their non-verbals are just as important as our verbals. It's not just what we say, but how we're saying it. What kind of environment should this conversation happen in? Of course, somewhere private. This is not a conversation for spectators. Somewhere that the person feels is safe for them, but is also safe for you. Rarely does someone who's intent on suicide want to take someone with them, but we must always risk assess. Most importantly, if we want the person to be honest with us, we need to create a non-judgmental environment where the person feels that they can fully tell you what's on their mind without being judged. Just doing that saves lives. The agreement we're looking to achieve in this conversation. We want a focus on outcomes. What's going to happen as a result of this conversation? Because actions can lead to hope. It's very easy to put our preferences at the front of the queue but we need to build agreements on what the person would prefer to do with our input and suggestions. And we must always agree a follow-up. How and when that follow-up happens depends on your relationship with the person and how imminent you might think that suicide could be. Follow-up could be, I'm taking you to A&E right now. Finally, the focus of the meeting. 80% of the talking should be done by the person you're talking to. Your 20% should just be either questions to get them to open up, or summarizing what you think they've just said to check your understanding. We need to always be respectful of what psychologists call a frame of reference. And the frame of reference is your view on the world. You and I have very different versions of normal. If you've got someone sat in front of you considering suicide because their dog's just died, you might love dogs and therefore completely get where they're coming from. You might, on the other hand, go, well, why don't they just buy another pet? All that matters in that moment, in that conversation, is the thing that's troubling the person has got them to this point, whether you get it or not. And finally, as human beings, we have a tendency to listen to someone just enough to think we know what the problem is, then shut them down and present the solutions to them. Please don't when it comes to either a suicide conversation or any conversation you have with someone about their mental health. Because actually just the act of being listened to is often the greatest form of therapy that people get. Nearly done on the slides now, just a couple more to go. So briefly, and apologies for the very text-heavy slide you're about to see, just wanted to lay out a few staff training options that are available. You'll see up the top there, mental health first aid. Great course, we deliver it ourselves, and there are various other companies do their own equivalents of it. You can see there the focus is on spotting someone in a mental health crisis and helping them out. So suicide will usually be covered on one of these courses, but of course it's one learning outcome out of several. So not a huge amount of time gets invested in the subject of suicide. But then we have some suicide specific training. Suicide first aid, a one-dayer, which is all about how do you spot someone in crisis and what can you do about it. Assist is very much known as the gold standard. Used a lot by clinical workers in how to apply an evidence-based intervention. I'd thoroughly recommend that everybody goes to the Zero Suicide Alliance website and has a go at that short, free training session on breaking stigma and having conversations. And in that bottom one, this is the very first time we've said this out loud in public, but we've been working with NCFE and LearnBox over the last 6 months to develop some off-qual qualifications around suicide awareness and structured suicide conversations. And we're launching them on the 10th of September. So when they come out, there'll be a one-day course on understanding suicide and why people might get to that point, understanding what works. And then there's a level 3 qualification, one day, on how to use a structured conversational model. How do you have that conversation? My final slide before we come back on cam. It wouldn't be a webinar at the moment without mention of COVID. So just a few things to say about COVID and suicide. Any data you're seeing at the moment saying about the increase in suicide in this country as a result of COVID is a load of rubbish. I'll take you back to the first graph today. We won't know suicide data for this year until next year when the coroner verdicts are in. Next September, we'll find out this year's. But we are seeing in some countries around the world, emerging data of quite a dramatic increase in suicide rates, including within the under 25s. I said unemployment doesn't cause suicide. It introduces risk factors for suicide, and the same is true of COVID. So a little bullet list there of some of the things that COVID and lockdown have brought that most definitely do increase risk of suicide in our current situation. And the point about COVID not causing suicide directly is a really important one for this reason. Hopefully someday soon, a cure, a vaccine will be released for COVID. If we could wipe out COVID tomorrow, the mental health effects of COVID won't disappear with it. And the current estimates are that we're going to be paying the mental health price of COVID and lockdown for the next 2 to 3 years. So before we come out the slideshow and onto Cam and deal with any questions you've got, just to mention on part 2. Part 2 is 2 weeks today, same time, midday, a 1-hour webinar again. Part 2 is focused on at an organisational level, are you doing enough around suicide prevention and around what to do if suicide happens? So where we very much wanted to aim this webinar at frontline workers, 2 weeks time is really about people who decide policies, procedures, staff training strategies, etc. So if you are one of those people, please book in for 2 weeks time. If you're not one of those people, please go and speak to that person within your organisation. It'd be great to see them there. Little dog, I'm going to inevitably ask, how was chat?
Some really interesting stuff in chat. Some comments, Kev, around the taboo nature of the subject and how therefore introducing a conversation around suicide can be really difficult, of course. And several people have mentioned training that they've been on as well, both online and I think classroom based as well, I'm guessing. So yeah, some really nice positive examples in chat. If people haven't seen it, some recommendations there. And we're just calling out for questions now. Please feel free to put questions in chat or turn your mics on and throw any questions out right now.
Bob, do you want to turn your camera on as well, mate?
I will indeed.
We'll see your smiling face.
There you go, here I am.
This is often the issue, isn't it? When you've been so comprehensive in your delivery, questions are slower to come through. But I'll disappear again because I think
we're getting some
Bob.
now. Yeah.
It's because I've been scouring at the camera too much. I've frightened everyone.
So, question, Kev, can you suggest some good ways to support a colleague affected by suicide?
Yeah, most definitely. There are a range of services out there. So first of all, let's not forget the NHS. As much maligned as they can be in mental health services, there are some really effective interventions. And we need that colleague, first and foremost, to either go to their GP and say what they've been thinking, or to get in touch with the local IAP service, IAPT. The IAP service is the first port of call in primary care for mental health issues. Of course, we're going to name check some of those awesome charities out there. So we've got Samaritans do an amazing, amazing job. Other notable mentions, Papyrus, if the person's under 35, really good around supporting young people with suicidal thoughts. Calm, the campaign against living miserably, which is specifically there. It's specifically there for male suicide, because for every woman that dies by suicide in this country, 3 men do, but they won't hang up the phone to anybody. So yeah, please do reach out for some support, encourage the person, and do encourage the person to properly take on board. No one's going to judge them from those organisations.
Yeah.
Knowing
I would just add to that, we often, when thinking about the issue from a workplace perspective, sort of encourage people to think about what supports are available in work. For example, employee assistance programs, I'm sure many of you have access to. And then, as Kev said, think about services locally where people live. Sometimes they're available based on where people work, such as NHS. Do not forget those third sector organisations as well. And it may be For some people, third sector can really be good while somebody's on a waiting list for an NHS service, but it can also be that people can access both in parallel. So yeah, those mix of in-work, local services, and some of those national charities can be really helpful.
I think two statistics to really hit home. The first one you've already seen. If people know that more than 1 in 5 of us experience suicidal thoughts, I'm not going to feel broken, a freak, etc. if I'm having them myself. Actually, it's relatively common. First stat. Second stat, and this is the worrying one. 78% of people who die by suicide were not in touch with mental health services in the year leading up to their death. 78% of people. Now, there's a range of reasons why, and stigma is one of them. But we need to get that message out there that mental health services are effective and are available.
Yeah, and that issue was touched on in chat earlier as well, Kev, making the point that it's an issue for everyone. You know, we tend to think of these things as something we may not be qualified to address.
Yeah.
Actually, you don't need a qualification to express care, concern, and help people get the right support.
Absolutely. Sorry, it's 72%, not 78%.
Yeah, I was just going to say, yeah, I wasn't going to have a stats argument with you. Question as well, Kev, can you suggest a helpful flyer that we could include in a newsletter or somewhere in the workplace to raise awareness?
Yeah, I'll tell you a really good resource. And yes, please do look at Samaritans, look at Mind, have got some really good resources. Mind are a national mental health charity, you all know that. And then the local Minds are separate charities. And different local Minds offer different services and have a different focus to others. And the Mind for Cambridgeshire, Peterborough and South Lincolnshire have got an amazing campaign called Stop Suicide. If you Google Stop Suicide Pledge, you'll easily find their website, and they've got a nice range of resources that are free to download as well.
And not just flyers, but videos as well. People that have survived suicide attempts, people that have maybe had someone intervene, and depending on what messages you're trying to get across, what channels you're using, that different media approach can be really effective, of course.
We were having a chat with Scott before this webinar started, and that project I was just telling you about that we've been working on for the last 6 months, as we've been doing that and we've been talking to people we needed to talk to around the subject of suicide, what became really clear was how many people, when we're talking professionally about suicide, then have a story to tell us about how they've been impacted. And about 1 in 4 conversations we've had with people have then had the person open up to us about how they've been impacted. Think of the numbers here, 6,500 deaths a year. And I've said to you, for each death, 115 people are impacted. So we're not far short of 750,000 people a year being impacted by suicide.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. Just another question coming up here. How to strike, good question, really interesting question. How to strike the balance between support into employment and thereby helping remove unemployment risk factors versus people's more imminent mental health needs. So something about getting that balance right.
And I guess the dream answer to that is the route into employment and the type of work that they have is nothing but positive for their mental health. Of course, we know alongside that, often a job seeker will have certain perceptions of what the process and the new job's going to be and develop a bunch of, I'm going to call them false anxieties. They'll get anxious about stuff that there's no need to get anxious about. So the more we can do to show them, and things like going into the workplace for an hour and actually seeing it, you know, tasting what it's going to be like, seeing if we can arrange for people to have a tapered start to their employment, can all be really effective.
I think we have a role as well within our sector around myth busting. So very often people wrongly think that work is going to introduce more stress, more problems, and increased risks for them around their mental well-being, when actually the evidence base tells us just the opposite. So I think the first port of call for us from our organisations is providing people with good information, I think the other thing as well, and I'm sure lots of people are doing this, anything that allows the client or the customer to be in the driving seat, any model of delivery that we have that helps people think about their employment options and have a plan and move on it, that is led by the customer, is always going to be more helpful. And attached to that, making sure that as they're discussing their employment aims and aspirations and needs, that they're also talking about achieving that balance in terms of their mental well-being support as well. And as people move forward on their employment journeys, rightly so, they should be thinking about, how do I need to adjust my mental health support as well?
Can I just come in there? Thanks, Bob. I don't know whether you can see these, but a couple of people have private messaged. So can I just remind anyone who's putting questions on to state to everyone? But a gentleman called Ellis says, can you, where does the statistic come from where 72% of individuals complete suicide?
That's government data, the exact source. Ellis, if you want to drop an email to that address, info@bdld.org.uk, we've taken it from a resource pack we've got, which is so full of data that we often forget what the source is, but it's credible. So if you want to drop me a line there, I'll check it up on the reference manual and come back to you with the exact data source.
And the other one that came in,
Scott, could you just get Mike a bit nearer to mouth, mate, please?
Very quiet, Scott.
Sorry, the other one that came in as a private message was, do you think chaplains have a role to play in supporting persons with thoughts of this?
Now, there's a whole conversation we could have here about the role religion can play with suicide. The course we're releasing next month, Steps, actually covers it within part of it. And just to reveal some of the data within that, there is a huge contrast between suicide rates for people with different belief systems. And the data we present, which is from the World Health Organization, suggests the widest gap between two belief systems is when you compare Islam with atheism. And you start thinking about that and you think, well, what does the religion teach about, is suicide allowed? And also, what does a religion teach about what happens to you after death? Are there some afterlife consequences of suicide? So when you look at a belief system like atheism, well, there's no one judging me. And if I die, that's it, my pain's gone. There is no afterlife consequence. And as a result, we see the suicide rate is far higher in atheism. I'm not saying that's the only factor, but it's certainly a factor. Contrast that with Islam, which clearly teaches that your life is not yours to take. And if you do choose to take it, you will be judged for that. So the religion teaches you not to complete suicide. So chaplains, imams, people who work within religions that have an anti-suicide stance most definitely have a role to play within their community, as do many other community leaders.
Yeah, it does seem from the research around the world, although as Kev said, there was a lot of factors in there and we're often not comparing like for like around the world, but it does seem that underpinning that religion does provide a protective factor around the issue of suicide. By extension, we know that one of the clues we sometimes might be looking for if we're concerned someone might be at risk of suicide is if they're turning away from a faith or a religion that they previously held. So yeah, people's relationship with their faith is really key. Obviously, anybody working to offer support within that faith is therefore also really key.
And what we'll typically see there is people moving away from a religion that is against suicide. So the person's kind of changing their belief systems to convince themselves that actually I'm not going to face consequences for this.
Just looking for the questions in chat there, Kev. Yeah, comment here. Comment, that leads to a question. Yes, it does. Sometimes people feel let down by professional services, insufficient communication between services. What's the best thing we can do in such cases?
I think the big one on services, and we say this a lot when we deliver mental health first aid, you will often hear people say, for instance, CBT is rubbish. And almost always, when you have a conversation with someone about why they believe that to be the case, it turns out they didn't click with their therapist, or their therapist was rubbish. So what we always encourage people to do is to go back to the services and say, could I have a change of therapist, please? Because you need that click to happen for the service to be effective. There is no point doing a talking therapy if you aren't cognitively engaged in it.
Yeah, I think as well, I don't know about people in the room, but my experience when supporting people with the health needs around employment is very often people are well versed in how welfare to work system and organisations are structured, how they work, what they do, what they don't do. NHS services tend to be a little bit vague, and both for us as service providers trying to work in partnership with them, but also for our customers and clients. So I think the first thing we can do is get a good understanding, a layperson's understanding of what mental health services do and don't do in your areas, and find a way of communicating that to your customers so that you're all in a position of knowledge. And it may be you look to create your own guide, or you might invite people in from your local NHS services to come in, provide some basic information and education. But any information helps people set their expectations and better navigate the health system. It's not going to change it, but at least we can start to understand what we can do within it, what to expect, what not to expect. Most local IAP services, if you ask them, will tell you what their waiting lists are like. So then people can strategize about what to do whilst they're on those waiting lists. So as in many things, knowledge is power. Often that stuff is not shared openly, but it's all there to be asked for, absolutely. Yeah, and
empowerment's key. I saw Suzanne just ask a question, and Claire's kind of preempted my response. Cognitive behavioural therapy is the talking therapy of choice in the UK. So by default, that's the talking therapy that tends to get offered. Suzanne's made the point that for some people with autism, CBT isn't very effective. We need to be empowered to therefore go to the IAP service and say, this form isn't working, what else can you offer me?
Yeah, yeah. I think we then have decisions, within our organisations around advocating for our customers. You know, if needs aren't being met and we can see there are really key issues, and there's a whole set of judgments we have to apply there. Are we advocating for people on a case-by-case basis? If we're looking organisationally, if there's a consistent difficulty that's not, or need that's not being addressed for our customers, do we need to address it at an organisation to organisation partnership level? No, and we need to make those decisions as to how we're going to advocate and engage NHS provision on those issues.
Bob, I think Scott was just about to stop us there as he's conscious of time. Last thing from us, please, before we hand back to Scott. End where we started. Think of Sam and JobSkiller, please. This session has been aimed specifically at our unemployed customers. Suicide does not discriminate. Every single one of us is a potential suicide risk. So please, with what happened with Sam at JobSkiller, let's use that. I know his family, friends and colleagues are keen to use what's happened to him as learning for us all. Let's recognise, please, none of us are immune, and we all need to be regularly checking in with ourselves and checking we're okay. Scott, back to you.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Bob. What a fascinating journey through that that challenging subject matter, and thank you very much. And I found that personally very, very interesting and very engaging. And there's a few other questions and comments coming in. So can I ask that if you've got anything else that you want to ask our two experts here, then either approach them direct or we can put you in touch if you come via the IEP. I think this is a debate and a conversation that quite rightly is going to go on for a very long time. And as Kevin said, you know, this was already in train, but the catalyst of bringing this to you is to be mindful yourselves. Coming up, we have lots and lots of other activity going on. As Kevin and Bob have said, in a couple of weeks, we're going to be having another webinar from our friends at Big Dog. Please make sure you get booked onto the Digital Technology Conference in September. And please, please, please head on over to the IEP YouTube channel where you can subscribe. There is so much fascinating content about so many different things there. A lot of you that are on the webinar today have been omnipresent on a number of those things before, and you would be able to concur that there's some great learning there. But the last thing I want to say is thank you very much, Kevin. Thank you, Bob, from Big Dog, Little Dog. A brilliant, fascinating webinar. And if you missed any of it or you want to review anything, get to the YouTube channel and do that. So thank you very much. Have a great day, everyone, and please stay safe. Thank you.